In this lecture, we're going to learn about constructor delegation. And this is a technique we have in C++ to have a constructor use another constructor and avoid code duplication. Suppose we have two constructors for our square class here. We have one that takes a single parameter and we have another that takes three parameters. We have modified the class now to have many member variables. We have the side, we have the color, we have an integer which is going to represent the shading of the square, and we have another double member variable for the position of the square on the screen, for example. Suppose we are doing some visual application. So we can set up our constructors like this and they are going to work. They are going to be two separate constructors. We can look at the implementations of these constructors. The one param constructor is going to only initialize the side parameter, and the others are going to be left uninitialized in the body here. And it is possible to do this, but I don't recommend it. But it is possible. So the second one is going to take three parameters, going to have side param, the color, and the shading. But notice that it is also leaving out the position. And I have left this out on purpose because I have something to show you a little later in this lecture. So this constructor is also using our initializer list here. So side is going to be initialized with side param, color is going to be initialized with color param, and shading is going to be initialized with shading param here. This is going to work. But we are really duplicating work because we have two constructors really doing almost the same thing. It is possible for the single parameter constructor here to reuse the constructor that is taking three parameters. And this is what we call constructor delegation. The one param constructor on top is going to delegate the construction of its object to another constructor. And the syntax to do that is really simple. We can do constructor delegation using the syntax we see here. We have the constructor here. You see, we have the function name, we have the parameters. Then we're going to put a colon and specify the constructor we want to call and specify the argument we want to call it with. Okay, so this really looks like initializer list, and it is an initializer list, but it is calling another constructor. And which constructor it is calling, if we look down, we're going to see that we have a constructor that exactly takes three parameters, and it is what we are passing here. Side param, the color, and the shading information, and that's what we pass in this constructor here. And the construction work for our object is no longer going to be done by this constructor here. It's going to be done by the three param constructor, and when the job is done, we're going to hit the body of the one param constructor here. So we need to think about the sequence of events when we have constructor delegation involved. So what is going to happen here? The one parameter constructor is going to be called if you pass one parameter when you are creating your object. So before we get into the body of the one parameter constructor, the compiler is going to realize the constructor delegation, and it is going to call the three parameter constructor to do the actual object creation. Then the three parameter constructor is going to construct the object, and it's going to initialize the object with the provided data. So we're going to use the arguments that are passed in the initializer list of our one parameter constructor here. And then after the object is created, we're going to hit the body of the three parameter constructor because that's the constructor that was called. After the body of the three parameter constructor, we're going to hit the body of the single parameter constructor, and control is going to go back to main where we created the object. And one thing you should know is that all these calls to these constructors can be seen in the call stack with the debugger, and we're going to see this in a minute. But now what we really want to know is the syntax to do constructor delegation and understand what this is going to do. It is going to delegate the work to build the object to another constructor. And the syntax to do this is to use an initializer list, which is going to call the other constructor. And this is really cool. Okay, some of you might be asking, okay, constructor delegation is good, and we have seen that we could use initializer list to do that. But what if I call the three param constructor myself like I do here? Well, I hate to break this to you, but this is not going to do what you want. This is not going to do constructor delegation. This is just going to create a local object of square, and it is going to be thrown away when the body of this function finishes executing. So if you really want to do constructor delegation, initializer lists are your only bet. This is one cases where we can only do this using initializer lists, and the importance of initializer lists is only getting better. And this is a case where we can only do this thing using initializer lists. Another thing you should know with constructor delegation is that if you have done constructor delegation in your class, you can't do any further initialization before or after the delegation call. So for example, if we look at the line here, we have our constructor delegation. We can't put up another initializer which is going to initialize the position. If we do this, the compiler is going to throw a compiler error. It's not allowed. The line here is going to try and put the initialization for the position in front of the delegation call, but this is also going to be a compiler error, and you can't do that. This is disallowed by the compiler. Okay, so this is really how constructor delegation is going to work. And after you have done your constructor delegation, you can really do anything you want in the body of your one param constructor here. For example, we can take this chance to initialize the position member variable, which wasn't initialized by any of the initializer lists. And we can do this, and it is going to work. Now that you know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and show you these things in action. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is constructor delegation. We are going to be reusing the code from the last lecture where we set up a square class. So let's grab the code from there. We're going to grab our classes and we're going to grab the VS Code folder because we're going to be using this for our settings. And then we're going to put this in our current project, which is constructor delegation again. We're going to grab this and open this in Visual Studio Code, and this is going to open our folder. The first thing we want to do is to open up the main CPP file and see that we have everything we need there. We don't really need to do the second call here because it's going to just give us a compiler error. What we want to learn about here is constructor delegation, and we're just going to use our code like this. We just want to use constructor delegation here. So let's head over to our square class and really modify it. We're going to add an int variable, which is going to be our shading, and we're going to add a double variable, member variable I should say, which is going to be our position. And we can open our square CPP file and close the left pane here because it is taking up space. So let's go to the header file, and we're going to set up a constructor which is going to initialize 3 of these guys here. So let's do that. We're going to put in a constructor which is going to take 3 parameters. Let's do that. We're going to say square, and we're going to say double side param. We're going to say const std string. We can do this. We're going to use a reference, and this is going to be color param, and we're going to say int shading param. This is going to be our thing, and it's not going to have anything by default here. And I think we can even take out the constructor we have in front here and make it a one param constructor. This is going to help us better in what we want to show in this lecture here. Can't take out this semicolon. Let's do this. And this is it. Let's go back to the CPP file and make sure that we have the implementations for these 2 constructors. We're going to go to square.cpp, and we're going to see that we no longer have a one param constructor. We can change this and change this to only initialize the first guy, and the others are going to be left out. But we can put in another constructor which is going to initialize 3 parameters, or 3 member variables I should say. So we're going to say square, and we're going to have double side param. I should go to the header and copy these parameters in because I can't remember how I named them. I can do that. So I'm going to put them in here. And then we're going to, let's check how we named our things. This should be m shading because it's a member variable, and this should be m position because it is a member variable. This is just trying to stay consistent with our naming convention here. We're going to put in our initializer list. So we're going to say m side. We're going to initialize this with side param, and we're going to do m color, and we're going to initialize this with color param, and we're going to do m shading, and we're going to initialize this with shading param. Hopefully you see that naming your things consistently it's going to help out. Okay, now we have the constructor in place, but we really have two constructors that are different, and they are going to be constructing objects here. But sometimes we want to make one constructor reuse the work that we have done in another constructor. So suppose, for example, the 3-param constructor here is doing some heavy computations, and we don't want to repeat all these computations in all these constructors and repeat our work. So a reasonable thing to do is to make the first constructor here, which is going to take one parameter, use a constructor that is taking more parameters, because we can pass default parameters when we call the other constructor here, which takes more parameters. I realize this is a little bit convoluted, but stay with me. We're going to explain these things step by step. Okay, so let's go down here and put in a few stdc out statements. We're going to say IOStream here because we want to print things out. And we're going to say that the 1-param constructor was called. And down here, we're going to say that the 3-param constructor was called. So let's go down here and put our body and make it aligned with what we did here. And our initializer list calls are not consistent. Here we are using curlies. Here we are using parents. I like to use curlies. So let's do that so that we really stay consistent here. Let's do this. We're going to change this to use curly braces. And the last one is also going to use curly braces. This is going to be consistent here. So we have this. We're going to go inside and put in our stdc out statement. And we're going to say that the 3-param constructor was called. Let's go back in main and see what we have there. We don't really want all this junk because we don't need this anymore. We just want to see what is used to build our object here. So let's take out the function here because we don't really need it anymore either. And we can build. We're going to use GCC to build this. And you see the build is good. If we bring up a terminal to run our program, we can clear and run rooster. We're going to see that 1-param constructor is called to build our object here. But we don't want the 1-param to do the job alone. We want to reuse the 3-param constructor to use the logic we have in here to build our object. And we can do constructor delegation. The syntax to do constructor delegation is really simple. You just use initializer lists. So we're going to take out the initializer list we have here, and we're going to change it to call the 3-param constructor. So we're going to say square, and we're going to pass it all the parameters that it expects. We only have one, so we can, for example, say side param here. Let's use curlies because that's consistent. We're going to say side param because that's what we have here. So let's do that. And for the others, we're going to just specify some values here to make the other constructor happy. So for example, we can specify a default value we want. Let's say black. You just need to be able to handle all this information in your 3-param constructor. So we just want to make it happy here. And for shading, let's pass in a 6. Let's suppose this makes sense for whatever application we're building here. And you see that Visual Studio Code is going to accept this syntax. We have no squiggly lines. So this must be working here. But I want you to understand the sequence of events when we set up a call like this. But before we analyze that, let's build and see what is going to happen here. So let's build with GCC. We're going to see that the build is good. So the calls here are going to be working. But let's see what we see in the terminal here if we run our executable. We're going to see that the 3-param constructor was called, then the 1-param constructor was called. So this hopefully proves that even if we call the single param constructor, the compiler is going to use the 3-param constructor to build our object. After the object is created, we're going to hit the body of the 3-param constructor because that's what constructed our object. Then control is to go back to our constructor and give us a chance to do whatever we want to do in our 1-param constructor here. We can even prove this with a debugger. So let's put a breakpoint on line 7 here and put a breakpoint on line 13 here in the body of each constructor. And then we're going to try and run this through the debugger. We are going to go to our run tab here, which is what we always use to run the debugger. And by the way, you can go to the run menu here and hit start debugging This is going to start debugging your application just like we do here. But I like to do things explicitly by coming here. So I am going to start my debugging session, and we don't really need to see any other thing. The first thing we see is that we have hit the body of the 3-parameter constructor. And look at what we have in main. In main, we are calling the 1-parameter constructor, but we have hit the body of our 3-parameter constructor. So what is going to happen is when we call the 1-parameter constructor, the compiler is going to hit the constructor here. But it's going to see that it is delegating the construction work to the 3-parameter constructor. Then the 3-parameter constructor is going to be called. We're going to hit its body. If we execute and get out of it, you're going to see that we're going to hit the body of the 1-parameter constructor. I just hit next a couple of times, and then I'm going to come in here. And if we hit step over, we're going to print the message here. And if we go to our terminal, we're going to see that the messages were printed out. And if we come out of this, we're going to come back to main, and our object is going to be already constructed. And if we look inside, we're going to see our information that was used to create the object here. This is really cool, and we can see all this data in our local variables here. So for example, you're going to see that the color, let's see if we can see this. You're going to see that the color is black. It is really hidden in all these options here, but we can hunt that down and find that. So we have the color, we have the shading, we have the position, which is really a junk value because we didn't really initialize this. But you see that we can see our data. And the main message in this lecture is that we can do constructor delegation. And the syntax to do that is in our Square CPP file. We can bring this back, and you have to use the initializer list as you see here. So this is the syntax, and you need to know this. Okay, so now that you know this, we're going to address the problem that some of you might be asking about what we are doing here. So what if we don't use our initializer list? Let's comment this out anyway. So we're going to take out all this. We can comment this out. And we don't use an initializer list, and we call the constructor directly in our body, the body of our 1-parameter constructor. What if we do that? Let's do that. So we're going to say square, and we're going to pass in side param because we have access to that. And then we're going to pass the other parameters here. The color is going to be black, and the shading is going to be 6. Let's do this, and you're going to see that the compiler is really not going to complain, but it is not going to do what you think it is going to do. Let's try and build the program and really see what is happening here. Hopefully we can see that. We are going to build with GCC. You're going to see that the build is good, but we're going to run Rooster, and we're going to see that 3-parameter constructor called, 1-parameter constructor called. This still looks like what we had in the last few runs. But what this is really doing, it's not doing constructor delegation. This is constructing your object and destroying it on the spot, because this is going to be a local object for our Square class. We can prove this by putting some message in our destructor. So let's say stdc out Square object destroyed, and we're going to see that the 3-parameter constructor is going to be called, but its destructor is going to be called before we hit the end of this function body here. Let's build and see if this actually is easier to see. You're going to see that the build is good, and we're going to clear and run Rooster. We're going to see that once we hit the body of the Square constructor, the 3-parameter constructor is going to be called, which is what we have here. And the output statement is going to be coming from this guy here. But because the compiler sees that this guy will never be used, it is a temporary object, the compiler is going to destroy it right away, and we're going to see Square object destroyed here. Then we're going to print this 1-parameter constructor called message here, and then we're going to say that the Square object that we built in the main function here was destroyed. You really need to understand these things. Hopefully you see that if you call your constructor directly in the body of your constructor here, this is not going to do constructor delegation, and I want you to know this. So let's take this out and bring in our initializer list back, and this is going to do proper constructor delegation. And let's try and build and run this program to see if we see different output. We're going to clear and run Rooster. We're going to see that only the 3-parameter constructor is going to be called. The one param constructor is going to be called after we do the proper object initialization. We're going to hit this body here. We're going to hit one param constructor called, and we see that we destroy only one square object because we don't have a local object constructed in the body of one param constructor here. Hopefully this is clear now. Another thing I want you to see is that we can't do further initialization if we are doing constructor delegation here. So for example, on this one param constructor of ours, we can't try and initialize the position member variable here. If we do that, we're going to get a compiler error. So let's try and do that before. So we're going to say M position, and we're going to put in any position. Let's put in 8.0 and put a comma here. And we're going to put a comma after this, and let's use curly braces here. I can't really remember using curly braces here. So let's do that. If we do this, we're going to get a compiler error. You see that we have a squiggly line. The compiler is not going to support this. If you are using constructor delegation, the constructor delegation should be the only thing you have in your initializer list. If we build this, we're going to get some weird compiler error. And let's see that constructor delegation follows member initializer list for square position, and this is not allowed. We're going to have a compiler error. If we try and put this position after the constructor delegation, we're also going to get the same thing because the compiler doesn't allow this. This is just how the compilers are wired, and we have to live with this. If we do this, we're also going to get a squiggly line because this is not allowed. Let's build with GCC to show you this. We're going to see a build error, and it is basically going to be the same thing, and you shouldn't really do this. So we can't have any further initialization before or after our constructor delegation here. Let's build and see that now this is building fine because we should prove this. We see the build is good, so the compiler is happy. Okay, so I think this really wraps up what I had to share with you in this lecture. But before I let you go, I want you to see that you can really do anything once you hit the body of your one param constructor here. For example, we can take this chance to initialize our position member variable, which is not initialized by any of the initializer lists we have in here. So we can go in here and, for example, put a value in our M position member variable. We can do this. So we're going to say M position equals 45.8, for example, and this is going to be accepted by the compiler. If we build, we're going to see that the build is going to be good. Okay, the build is good, and this is really all. I hope now you know that you can do constructor delegation to offload the job to build your object to other constructors. Those constructors are going to take over your job to do construction, and when they are done doing the job, they are going to give you a chance to do whatever you want in your delegating constructor, as we see in this one param constructor here. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. We are going to stop here in this one. In the next one, we're going to learn about copy constructors. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.